Sophie Carter had barely found a parking spot on the crowded street when her phone buzzed with another reminder about the documents Mark had left on the kitchen counter that morning. He needed them urgently, texting her twice while she was loading the dishwasher and getting their daughter's jacket zipped before school. So now, after a full day of cleaning, laundry, errands, and picking up the kids, she found herself standing in the lobby of his downtown Denver office, with a cardboard box pressed against her hip. The building's lobby was polished marble and glass, the kind of place where people walked quickly with purpose. Sophie felt out of place in her soft sweater and jeans, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail because her son had spilled juice on her shirt earlier. She adjusted the box in her arms and followed the receptionist's directions to the third floor. As she stepped out of the elevator, she noticed how quiet the corridor was. Just the low hum of office lights and the steady clicking of keyboards behind closed doors. She walked toward the conference room where Mark usually held his afternoon meetings. The door was glass, framed in metal, with a long table visible inside. But before she reached for the handle, she froze. Mark's voice carried through the glass, loud, confident, a tone he almost never used with her anymore. "No, I'm serious," he said, laughter in his voice. "If you saw her these days, you'd understand. My wife looks like some kind of swamp scarecrow." Sophie's breath hitched. Her brain stalled. She wasn't even sure she heard correctly until the room erupted in laughter. She leaned slightly to the side, and through the glare of the overhead lights, she caught a clear glimpse of him. Mark, in his gray button-down, sleeves rolled to his forearms, leaning back in his chair like he owned the room. Across from him sat Veronica, the young coworker he had mentioned once or twice. 20-something, glossy hair, bright lipstick, that effortless confidence Sophie used to have in her own early 20s. Veronica laughed the loudest, tossing her hair back as if Mark had just told the funniest joke she'd ever heard. Then, almost casually, she reached out and touched his arm. Not flirtatious enough to be called inappropriate, but intimate enough that anyone paying attention would understand exactly what was happening beneath the surface. Mark smirked, enjoying the attention, enjoying the laughter, enjoying being the man who could joke about his own wife like she was a character from a cheap sitcom. Sophie felt the box slipping in her hands. She tightened her grip before it fell, her fingers trembling. Her chest tightened as if someone had reached inside and squeezed her heart with an icy fist. She didn't move, couldn't move. No one inside the room seemed to notice the woman standing outside, his wife, the mother of his children, the person who had driven across the city just to bring him something he needed. Their voices continued, light, mocking, dismissive. A colleague chimed in with something Sophie couldn't make out, more laughter. Veronica leaned closer to Mark, her hand grazing his shoulder this time. Sophie swallowed, but her throat was dry and burning. She slowly lowered the box to the carpeted floor. She set it down so gently it made no sound, as if she were afraid even her presence in the hallway might be an inconvenience. Without knocking, without announcing herself, without giving him the chance to see her standing there like a ghost, Sophie turned away. Her footsteps were silent on the carpet as she walked back to the elevator, each step feeling heavier than the last. The doors closed in front of her, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The drive home to Aurora felt longer than usual. The sky was already dimming into dusk, washing the rooftops in orange and purple, but Sophie didn't notice the beauty of it. Her hands rested stiffly on the steering wheel, replaying the scene in the conference room over and over. His voice, the words, the laughter. The phrase "swamp scarecrow" looped like a cruel refrain, burrowing into her chest. When she finally entered the house, the familiar warmth of the living room lights did nothing to steady her. She walked down the hallway, quietly opening her children's bedroom doors, watching their slow, even breathing. She brushed a strand of hair off her daughter's forehead and stood there, her heart cracking in a way she didn't know how to hold together. Back in the kitchen, she sank into a chair. No sobs, no dramatic collapse, just stillness, like her body had shut down before her emotions could catch up. Her hands rested on the table, shaking faintly as the humiliation settled into her bones. Long after the house went quiet, Mark's laugh and Veronica's hand on his arm echoed through her mind, refusing to fade. Tonight, the silence hurt more than any scream ever could. The house was quiet when Sophie finally turned off the living room lights. Only the soft glow from the kitchen under cabinet lamps remained, casting long, muted shadows across the tile floor. She stood for a moment with her hands braced on the counter, feeling the weight of the day seep into her shoulders. The awful comment she'd overheard at Mark's office still pulsed faintly in her chest, like a bruise forming under the skin, but something else pushed its way forward too. Memory. Not the sharp kind that cuts, but the softer, aching kind that reminds you of who you used to be. She poured herself a glass of water and sat down at the table. The chair creaked lightly, and for a moment she simply looked around the dim kitchen, the same room where she'd warmed bottles, cut fruit into tiny squares, soothed tantrums, and answered late-night questions about monsters under the bed. It all felt both intimate and strangely distant, like a life she'd been living on autopilot. Years ago, this kitchen had felt like the beginning of a dream. Back when she was still Sophie Brooks, a spirited interior design student with too many ideas and not enough hours in the day to sketch them all. She used to wear bright lipstick, silver rings, little boots she found in thrift stores. She used to rearrange her dorm room every few weeks because she liked testing how space influenced mood. She used to laugh easily, loudly, and people noticed her in a room. But life swerved sharply, almost without warning. Her mother's illness had come first. Helen had always been strong, independent, the kind of woman who refused help until she could no longer hide how much pain she was in. Hospital visits turned into recovery plans, which turned into appointments with specialists, which turned into a quiet resignation Sophie could see in her mother's eyes. Sophie had put school on pause, telling herself it was temporary, just until things stabilized. She moved back home, took a part-time job, tried to balance caregiving with planning a future she never stopped believing would come. Then came the kids. Her son was born anxious and sensitive, brilliant in ways she adored, but easily overwhelmed by noise, lights, crowds, even the texture of certain foods. Therapists became a regular part of their lives. Child psychologists, occupational therapists, school counselors who met with Sophie more often than they met with her son. She learned how to prepare him for transitions, how to help him breathe through panic, how to advocate for him when teachers didn't understand. Her daughter's infancy had been different. Colic so severe it turned every night into a battlefield of shushing, pacing, bouncing, crying, both of them exhausted until sunrise. Sophie barely slept for months. She lived on caffeine and instinct, trying to keep everyone fed, clean, comforted, stable. And through it all, Mark drifted slowly away, almost imperceptibly at first. He had once been attentive, affectionate in a simple, earnest way. But the more life demanded of Sophie, the more he seemed to detach from it entirely. He started sleeping on the couch, claiming back pain, then stress, then just needing space. Their conversation shortened into brief exchanges about groceries, schedules, bills. They rarely finished a sentence together. Sometimes Sophie wondered when she had become background noise in her own marriage. Tonight, she could feel it more clearly than ever. Hours passed after the kids went to bed. Sophie sat alone in the soft kitchen light until the front door finally clicked open. Mark stepped in, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke mixed with a sweet perfume she didn't recognize. He didn't greet her, didn't ask how the kids were. He just tossed his keys onto the entry table and headed toward the hallway. Sophie stood and followed him a few steps. "Dinner's in the fridge," she said quietly. "The kids were asking about you." Mark didn't turn around. "I ate already," he muttered, "and I'm exhausted." She tried again, her voice gentler. "We haven't talked in days, Mark. He stopped, exhaled sharply, and looked at her with an impatience so familiar it no longer hurt the same way. I don't want to talk right now. If you need someone to listen to you, find somebody else." The words struck her like a cold wind from an open door, not shouted, not cruel in volume, but cruel in truth. Mark disappeared down the hall, leaving the scent of perfume lingering in his wake. Sophie remained in the kitchen, her hand still resting on the back of the chair, realizing suddenly, painfully, that maybe she did need someone else. Not another man, not another relationship, but another life, another version of herself. The one she had lost somewhere between therapy appointments, sleepless nights, and the slow erosion of a marriage that no longer held her. That version stirred faintly inside her, as if waking up for the first time in years. The next morning unfolded like any other in Sophie Carter's Aurora home, though nothing inside her felt familiar anymore. Cereal bowls clinked against the counter, milk sloshed as her daughter poured too quickly, and the muffled sound of cartoons drifted from the living room. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds, soft and pale, casting striped patterns across the table where the kids' backpacks lay half-zipped and waiting. Sophie moved through the motions automatically, packing lunches, checking folders, tying shoelaces, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Each task felt like she was watching herself from a distance, as if the version of her who had carried a box into Mark's office yesterday was still standing in that hallway, listening to him laugh about her through the glass. When the kids finally ran outside to wait for the school bus, Sophie lingered in the doorway, her hand on the frame. A quiet decision settled inside her chest, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Something had to change. She walked back into the kitchen, wiped the table clean, and took a slow breath. Then she reached for the silver laptop she barely used anymore. The hinge creaked faintly as she opened it, a sound that made her feel unexpectedly vulnerable, like she was prying open a sealed part of her life. Her fingers trembled as she typed the first search. Interior Design Certificate Programs, Colorado. Then another. Denver interior design firms hiring junior designers. And another, how to rebuild a portfolio after years away. Search results filled the screen, images of modern spaces, job postings full of requirements she wasn't sure she met anymore, college programs she once dreamed of completing. Her throat tightened, fear rising like a slow tide. Too old, too rusty, too invisible, too forgotten. She hadn't opened CAD software in years. She hadn't presented a design board since before her son started therapy, before her daughter was born, before her entire world narrowed into a cycle of caregiving and survival. Sophie pressed her palms to the table, breathing through the heaviness. She knew if she closed the laptop now, she might never gather the courage to open it again. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She hesitated, then picked it up and called her mother. Helen answered on the second ring, her voice warm and steady. "Hey, sweetheart, everything okay?" Sophie swallowed. "Mom, I'm thinking about applying for design jobs again. I don't know if it's stupid. I don't know if anyone would even look at me." There was a quiet pause on the other end, thoughtful, not doubtful. "Sophie," Helen said gently, "you've always had an eye for beauty. You turned every apartment we ever lived in into something warm and alive. You could make a cardboard box feel like a home. Of course someone will look at you." Sophie pressed her forehead to her hand, her eyes burning. "I'm scared. I'm out of practice. What if I embarrass myself?" "Then you get up and try again," Helen replied. "And if you need help with the kids while you do it, I'm right here. Always." The reassurance settled over Sophie like a soft blanket. After they hung up, she felt lighter, not fearless, but steady enough to keep going. She spent the next 2 hours updating her resume, stripping out years of silence, carefully shaping the parts of her early career that still mattered. She found old photos of projects she had helped with, scanned sketches from her design school portfolio, photographed the little room makeovers she'd done at home over the years. Piece by piece, she rebuilt a small portfolio. Not perfect, not polished, but honest. Finally, she pulled up the website of a boutique design firm in Lodo she had admired for years. Their work was modern, warm, lived in, spaces that felt like people, not showrooms. She filled out the application form, attached her files, and hovered over the submit button. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Her stomach knotted. Her pulse beat in her ears, but she clicked. Send. The screen confirmed her submission, and she closed the laptop with shaking hands. 2 days passed. Sophie didn't think about it often, not because she didn't care, but because it hurt to hope. On the third morning, while pouring cereal for the kids, her phone chimed with an email notification. She wiped her fingers on a dish towel and checked the screen. We would like to invite you to an interview. For a moment, the kitchen faded. The cereal bowls, the cartoons, the noise of the morning. All she felt was her heart racing, loud and bright inside her chest. Terror and hope tangled tightly together. But hope was winning. Sophie stood in front of the hallway mirror early that morning, smoothing the fabric of a dress she hadn't worn in years. It was a simple navy work dress from a time when she still imagined herself building a real design career. Before children, before exhaustion, before Mark's growing indifference. She applied light makeup, just enough to brighten her face, then tied her hair back into a neat, low ponytail. When she stepped back and looked at her reflection, she didn't see transformation. She simply saw effort. And for now, that was enough. The kids were still half asleep as she helped them with jackets and backpacks. The sky over Aurora was soft and gray, the kind of morning where everything felt slow enough to reconsider. But Sophie didn't reconsider. She guided them into the car, dropped them off at school with hurried kisses, and turned her steering wheel toward Denver, toward Lodo, toward possibility. She had barely walked back through the front door after school drop-off to grab her purse when Mark emerged from the bathroom, still in his undershirt, toothbrush in hand. He froze mid-chew as he glanced at her outfit. "You're dressed up," he said, eyebrows raised. Sophie reached for her keys. "I have an interview." Mark leaned against the doorway, smirking. "Office work isn't reheating chicken nuggets, Sophie. Don't embarrass yourself." The words slid off him casually, as if they were harmless, but they landed like pebbles dropped into a pond, small, sharp, disrupting the surface all the same. Sophie paused, just long enough to breathe once, slowly. "I'll manage," she said softly, then walked past him without looking back. The drive into Lodo threaded through traffic and construction barrels, opening into a maze of brick warehouses converted into art studios, tech offices, and the kind of boutique firms that filled design magazines. Sophie found parking 2 blocks from the building. Stepping out of her car with a mix of nerves and determination humming under her skin, the firm's office was housed in a renovated industrial space, exposed brick walls, tall windows letting in crisp daylight, black metal beams contrasting with warm wooden floors. She felt an unexpected comfort stepping inside, like her younger self, the one with sketchbooks and design ideas taped to her dorm wall, might still be reachable. A receptionist led her to a glass-walled meeting room where the creative director, a poised woman in her 40s with a sharp bob and kind eyes, greeted her. "Sophie Carter, thanks for coming in," she said, offering a warm handshake. "We've looked at your portfolio. I'm curious to hear more about your process." Sophie's nerves tightened again, but she sat down, clasped her hands, and began speaking softly, honestly. She talked about how she approached space, not with trends first, but with questions about how people actually lived in them. She talked about the small projects she'd done at home, the ways she used color and light to make anxious children feel calmer, the instinct she had for creating spaces that felt safe. The creative director listened intently, nodding. "You think in emotional layers," she said at one point. "Not every designer understands that. It's a strength." Sophie blinked, almost startled. No one had complimented her instincts, her natural way of seeing the world, in years. After a brief tour of the office and a few more questions, the interview wrapped up. The director walked her to the elevator. "We'll be in touch," she said with a small smile, one of those expressions that hinted at something hopeful but not promised. Driving home, Sophie replayed the conversation in her head, replaying every stumble, every pause. By the time she pulled into the driveway, uncertainty had settled in again. She had no idea whether she had made a strong impression or simply been polite and forgettable. The next morning, as she loaded dishes into the sink, her phone buzzed. She wiped her hands on a towel and checked the screen. "Congratulations. We'd like to offer you the position." Her breath caught. She stood motionless, rereading the sentence until it finally sank in. This wasn't luck. This wasn't pity. She had earned it. When Mark came home that evening, she told him the news. He shrugged, barely glancing up from his phone. "That's good, I guess," he said, "as long as it doesn't interfere with everything else." Everything else? The house, the kids, his schedule, his comfort. Sophie didn't push back. She didn't argue. She simply nodded and walked into the kitchen. But when she was alone, she allowed herself a quiet smile, a small, private victory blooming inside her chest. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was the first real win she'd felt in years. The next several weeks unfolded in a blur. One of those stretches of time where days melted into each other, and Sophie moved through them with a mixture of exhaustion and purpose she hadn't felt in years. Her life became a careful choreography, getting the kids ready for school, packing lunches, driving 25 minutes into Lodo, attending meetings, taking measurements on site, commuting home through traffic, cooking dinner, supervising baths and homework, then opening her laptop again long after the children had fallen asleep. She was tired, aching, bone-deep tired, but not in the way she used to be. This exhaustion carried a spark, a hum beneath it, something alive. As she sketched late at night at the kitchen table, lit only by a small lamp, she felt a version of herself slowly returning. Her first real assignment came sooner than she expected. The creative director handed her a folder one morning with a smile. "A small boutique shop in Cherry Creek wants a refresh," she said. "They want warm, textured, welcoming, and not too intimidating for real customers. In the owner's words, I think your sensibilities might be perfect for this." Sophie held the folder as if it were something fragile. Her own project, her own responsibility. She visited the boutique that afternoon. It was small but charming. Dark wood counters, mismatched shelves, a cramped back office. She took photos from multiple angles, chatted with the owner, asked about customer flow, budget, and the kind of atmosphere the shop wanted to evoke. That night, while the kids were asleep upstairs, Sophie began drafting her first concepts: soft amber lighting, natural wood tones, layered textures, a more open layout with curved shelving to guide customers gently through the space. She envisioned small pockets where people could linger, places that felt human, not staged. By the next week, she presented her preliminary boards at the office. She expected polite nods and maybe a few suggestions. Instead, the creative director leaned forward, eyes bright. "You understand how people feel their way through a room," she said. "This is intuitive. Real." A coworker added, "The flow is beautiful. You've got a really natural eye." Compliments, real ones, not obligatory or performative, were something Sophie had forgotten how to absorb. She felt them like warm sunlight on skin that had been cold for too long. The client loved the design. By the time the project entered the revision phase, Sophie's colleagues began stopping by her desk more often, asking her opinion on color palettes or materials. Her confidence grew quietly, like a slow-burning flame. She didn't brag. She didn't show off. She didn't even tell Mark much about it, mostly because he wouldn't have asked. And Mark had become even harder to read lately. He was traveling for work more frequently. Overnight trips to Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, even out-of-state conferences she didn't recognize because he never sent itineraries. He returned home smelling of hotel soap and something floral she couldn't quite place. His shirts sometimes came back wrinkled in odd ways, as if they had been tossed on floors instead of hung neatly in a suitcase. Still, she said nothing. Not because she was afraid, but because something inside her was changing. She was no longer holding the marriage together with desperate hands. She was simply observing it, its cracks, its silences, its slow collapse. One evening, while finalizing lighting adjustments for the boutique project, Sophie glanced at the clock. It was past 9. Mark still hadn't checked in. The kids were asleep. The house was too quiet. She hesitated, then picked up her phone and called him. It rang twice before he answered. "What?" he said, voice low and irritated. Behind him came murmurs, indistinct but unmistakably feminine. Then the sound of someone laughing. A woman. Sophie froze. "Where are you?" she asked. "It's late. I just wanted to know if you were okay." Mark sighed harshly. "God, Sophie, do you have to monitor everything I do? I told you, I'm traveling, I'm working. Stop being controlling." "I wasn't," she began, but he cut her off. "I don't have time for this." The line went dead. Sophie lowered the phone slowly, staring at the darkened screen. A few months ago, the sound of another woman's laughter in the background might have shattered her. She would have cried silently, replaying the call in her mind, questioning her worth until she felt hollow. But tonight, something settled instead. A clarity, sharp and undeniable. Not rage, not heartbreak, just understanding. She turned back to her laptop. The boutique's lighting plan waited on the screen, half finished. She took a breath, reached for her stylus, and continued drawing. Her lines were steady, even graceful. For the first time in a long time, her hand didn't shake. The marriage she had been clinging to was nothing more than a memory, one she no longer needed to resurrect. There was a different life forming quietly in front of her, illuminated by the glow of her screen, shaped by her own hands, and she wasn't going to look away from it anymore. Spring crept into Aurora slowly, softening the air and stretching daylight a little longer each evening. And with each passing week, Sophie shifted in ways no one, least of all Mark, had anticipated. The changes weren't dramatic at first. They were small, almost invisible to anyone who didn't look closely. But Sophie felt each one, like a tiny reclamation of the woman she had once imagined she could become. She began attending a late-morning Pilates class near the Lodo office on days she didn't have early meetings. The studio was bright and open, with tall windows facing the street and sunlight pooling across polished floors. At first she struggled through the movements, her muscles trembling, her breath shallow. But each week the shakes grew softer, her balance steadier. She walked out of every class feeling taller, not just in posture, but in presence. She started preparing healthier meals at home too, not elaborate recipes, just simple, fresh foods that made her feel good. Smoothies in the morning, bowls of roasted vegetables with quinoa. Snacks she could tuck into her bag between client visits. She wasn't dieting. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply taking care of her body for the first time in years. And with her first real paycheck, Sophie did something she hadn't allowed herself to do in a long time. She bought a few things just for herself. A clean, minimalist wardrobe, black trousers, soft knits, crisp white tops, a simple pair of gold earrings that caught the light when she turned her head, a skincare set she'd once admired but always considered too indulgent, and 2 brand-new backpacks for the kids, ones they had picked out themselves, grinning ear to ear. Watching them bounce around the kitchen wearing their new backpacks, Sophie feels something warm flicker inside her chest. Pride, maybe, or joy, or the faint buzz of possibility. At work, the shift was even more noticeable. She started contributing not just to her own boutique project, but to the larger ones as well, helping refine mood boards, suggesting layout adjustments, recommending softer textures for family-focused spaces. She wasn't loud in meetings, but when she spoke, people listened. One afternoon, while she was reviewing material samples at her desk, a quiet voice spoke behind her. "You have a good eye." She turned to see a man she'd only heard about before, Jonathan Pierce, one of the most respected leaders in Denver's design and development circles. He wasn't flashy or intimidating. He carried himself with a calm, grounded confidence that made people naturally gravitate toward him. Tall, composed, his suit understated but perfectly tailored. Sophie blinked, unsure if he was actually speaking to her. "Oh, thank you. I'm still learning." Jonathan smiled, the kind of smile that was gentle rather than condescending. "Learning is good, but instinct is better, and you have strong instincts." He glanced at her mood board. "You understand how people actually live in a space. That's rare." He left as quietly as he'd arrived, offering nothing more than a polite nod. But his words lingered. They didn't inflate her, they grounded her. They made her want to work harder, not for approval, but for the satisfaction of creating something real. Back at home, Mark began noticing the shift too, though not in the ways that mattered. At first, he dismissed it as new job energy, but then he started watching her longer. His gaze lingered when she walked across the living room in her simple but elegant work clothes. He noticed her standing straighter. Speaking more clearly, moving through the house with a steadiness he hadn't seen in years. Sometimes he looked puzzled, as if he couldn't quite decide whether the change made him uncomfortable or intrigued. But Sophie didn't give him much room to explore either emotion. She remained polite, cordial even, but she had become emotionally distant. Not cold, just elsewhere. Her days were full of work, kids, and the pieces of herself she was quietly stitching back together. She didn't look at Mark for validation anymore. She didn't seek his opinion. She simply coexisted with him, the way one might coexist with a neighbor they barely knew. One evening, after dinner, she sat on the floor helping her daughter build a block tower. Her daughter leaned into her shoulder and studied her thoughtfully. "Mom," the little girl asked, her voice curious and innocent, "do you work like Dad now?" Sophie paused mid-reach, then let out a soft laugh, one that felt genuine, light, and free of bitterness. "Yeah," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "I work like Dad now, only—" Her daughter looked up. "Only what?" Sophie smiled, the corner of her mouth lifting with a spark she hadn't felt in years. "Only I draw more," she said softly, "and yell less." Her daughter giggled, leaning into her again as the block tower wobbled and fell, and as Sophie pulled her close, a warmth spread across her chest. Something gentle, something alive, something like herself returning. The house had settled into its familiar quiet by the time Sophie finally slipped into her bedroom. The children were asleep, their doors closed, soft nightlights glowing behind them. Down the hall, the television had been turned off, leaving behind only the steady hum of the refrigerator and the faint whir of the ceiling fan. Sophie moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the stillness. She had showered earlier, letting the warm water rinse away the heaviness of the day. Now she opened her dresser drawer and pulled out a satin robe she hadn't worn in years, a soft champagne color that felt impossibly smooth between her fingers. She put it on without rushing, tying the sash loosely at her waist. She wasn't dressing for Mark. She wasn't dressing for anyone. She simply wanted to remember what it felt like to do something small and gentle for herself. She settled onto the bed with a book, propping a pillow behind her, letting the warm glow from the bedside lamp pool around her. The robe shimmered faintly in the light. Catching on the folds as she shifted, she turned a page slowly, feeling her mind unclench in a way it rarely did. It was in this moment, quiet, soft, deeply her own, that the bedroom door opened. Mark stepped inside. He paused in the doorway, eyes widening just a fraction. For a split second, the habitual sharpness in his expression fell away, replaced by something closer to surprise or recognition. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time in years. "Sophie," he said slowly, "you look different." She didn't respond, simply kept her place in the book with a finger and looked up at him with calm curiosity. Mark took a few steps into the room, drawn in by something he couldn't name. "You're reading?" he said, baffled, as if this were a foreign sight. "I do that sometimes," Sophie replied softly. He let out a short, awkward laugh and sat down on the edge of the bed, much closer than she expected. His gaze drifted down her robe, over her bare shoulder, lingering longer than she liked. The sudden shift in his demeanor felt almost theatrical, as if her quiet confidence, her glow, her peace had reminded him of a version of her he had taken for granted. His hand slid onto her knee. "You know, it's been a while." His voice dropped into a low tone he probably imagined sounded seductive. "Maybe we should reconnect. Just you and me." Sophie looked at his hand, then she reached down, lifted it gently and placed it back in his lap. "Mark," she said, her voice steady, "I don't want that." He frowned. "What? Why not?" She exhaled slowly, closing her book. "Because whatever we had, it's not what we have now. And I don't want to pretend it still is." The air shifted immediately. Something inside him snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a brittle sharpness. His lips tightened, his voice sharpening into a defensive edge. "So that's it?" he demanded. "You think you're too good for me now? What? Do you have someone else? Is that it?" Sophie stared at him, unflinching, her expression neither angry nor wounded, just honest. "Does it really matter?" she asked quietly. "You haven't been my husband in a long time." The words weren't meant to cut, but they did. Mark jerked back slightly, then rose abruptly from the bed. His jaw clenched as he raked a hand through his hair, pacing once before his frustration overtook him. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "Unbelievable." Then, without waiting for an answer, he stormed toward the door. He slammed it behind him so hard the sound echoed down the hallway. The room fell silent again. Sophie sat there, the lamp's warm light still glowing around her, her book still resting in her lap. Her heart wasn't pounding. Her hands weren't shaking. The tension that had once consumed her in moments like this was simply gone. She felt peaceful, not triumphant, not vindictive, just peaceful. As if for the first time in years, she had drawn a boundary, not out of fear or desperation, but out of quiet certainty, a line she had needed for far too long. She leaned back against the pillow, pulled the robe a little closer around her shoulders, and opened her book again. And the night stayed gentle. Morning light filtered through the blinds when Mark appeared in the doorway, already dressed in a tailored navy suit. His cologne was stronger than usual, the polished look clearly meant to project importance. He stood with the stiff confidence he always wore before corporate events, adjusting his cufflinks as if performing for an imaginary audience. "There's a gala tonight," he said casually. "Grand Hyatt. Big deal. You should come." He didn't look at her when he spoke. Not truly. It was the voice he used when he wanted something, when he imagined she existed solely to make him look good. For years, Sophie had gone along, smiling, smoothing, supporting, the polished accessory he could count on. But today she felt completely still inside. Not cold, not cruel, just clear. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I won't be attending." Mark blinked, momentarily thrown off script. "Why not?" "I have other plans," she answered simply. He opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. With a clipped exhale, he turned away, muttering something about image and professional expectations. He left the house moments later, slamming the door harder than necessary. Evening fell over Denver with its usual shimmer, lights stretching across downtown like a necklace of gold. Inside the Grand Hyatt's ballroom, the corporate world tilted into motion, glittering dresses, dark suits, champagne flutes, and conversations sharpened with ambition. Mark arrived with Veronica on his arm, their pairing drawing a few raised eyebrows but not enough to stir the air. Veronica clung to him eagerly, laughing at every stray comment, the performative sweetness almost saccharine. He fed on it, letting himself believe the room saw him as successful, desirable, in control. But the illusion began to crack the moment a soft ripple of whispers washed through the crowd. He's here. Pierce actually showed up. And he brought someone? Mark's head snapped toward the staircase just as Jonathan Pierce entered the ballroom, Denver's architectural wunderkind, polished but understated, known for attending events alone, uninterested in social theatrics. Tonight, however, he wasn't alone. A woman descended the staircase at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her gown was deep emerald, the fabric catching every glint of light like it was woven with intention. The dress fit her with elegant restraint, the color making her skin glow against the warm chandeliers overhead. Her hair framed her face softly, a quiet sophistication replacing the exhaustion that had once dimmed her features. It took Mark several seconds to recognize her. Sophie. His Sophie. Except clearly not his anymore. She carried herself with a confidence he couldn't place, as if the ground beneath her feet was finally her own. She wasn't clinging, wasn't nervous, wasn't standing behind anyone. She walked with Jonathan as if she belonged in that world, and more importantly, as if she knew she did. Veronica's grip on Mark's arm tightened. "Is that your wife?" Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. All around them, executives, designers, and partners murmured, the attention tilting towards Sophie with growing intrigue. Who is she? That dress is incredible. Pierce never brings a date. Never. She must be someone important. Jonathan leaned towards Sophie slightly, saying something that made her smile. A quiet, natural smile she hadn't worn in years. Not forced, not polite, not exhausted. A smile that reached her eyes. Mark felt it like a punch. From across the room, he watched as she greeted two senior executives, speaking clearly, warmly, with an ease he didn't remember giving her space to show. He saw the way people listened to her, genuinely listened, impressed by her poise, her insight, her presence. It hit him with slow, suffocating clarity. She had grown into someone he never believed she could be. Or perhaps she always was, and he had refused to see it. Veronica tried to pull him toward the champagne table, but he barely moved. His jaw tightened, his eyes locked on Sophie as she engaged in conversation with Jonathan and another design partner, her posture relaxed, her gestures confident. Mark had come tonight expecting to shine. But Sophie, radiant, self-assured, untouchable, eclipsed him without even looking in his direction. And for the first time in a very long time, Mark felt something unfamiliar coil in his chest. Dread. Not because he was losing her, but because he could finally see she no longer needed to be found. For the rest of the evening, the ballroom carried a subtle but undeniable shift. A gravitational pull that seemed to follow Sophie wherever she went. It wasn't about the emerald gown or the way her hair framed her face. It wasn't even about arriving beside Jonathan Pierce, though that alone had stirred enough whispers to fill a hallway. It was the way she held herself. She spoke to each person with an ease she once doubted she'd ever reclaim. Her voice was calm, warm, sure of itself. She listened thoughtfully, offered insights without hesitation, and laughed freely. A soft, genuine sound that made people lean in rather than look away. Every conversation she stepped into became gentler, brighter, more grounded. Jonathan stayed close enough to guide introductions, but far enough to let her shine on her own. When he introduced her to senior partners, he did so without theatrics, with the quiet confidence of someone who recognized real talent. "This is Sophie Carter," he said more than once. "You're going to want to remember that name. Her instincts with spatial flow are remarkable." Each time, Sophie felt a flicker of disbelief. Not because she doubted him, but because no one had spoken about her with that kind of respect in years. Not Mark, not anyone at home. Hearing it aloud felt like a door she had forgotten to knock on was suddenly opening from the inside. Across the ballroom, Mark saw it all. He saw the way people gravitated toward her, the way Jonathan looked at her, not possessively, not flirtatiously, but with professional admiration, almost pride. He saw the conversations she led, the smiles directed at her, the small notes being made by executives who rarely spared a glance for spouses. And worst of all, he saw how effortlessly she existed in that world without him. Veronica tried to pull his attention back repeatedly. "Do you want more champagne? Mark, are you even listening? Seriously, what's wrong with you tonight?" But her voice only made the noise in his head louder. His eyes kept drifting back to Sophie, radiant, collected, self-assured. And each time he saw her smile at someone else's comment, something in him tightened painfully. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was the one who stayed home. She was the one who waited. She was the one who apologized. Yet here she was, slipping out of the box he'd placed her in, and thriving. Near the end of the gala, Jonathan touched Sophie's elbow lightly, guiding her toward the exit before the crowd began to thin. Mark saw that, too. The gesture wasn't intimate, just respectful. But it made his stomach twist all the same. Outside, the crisp Denver night wrapped around them as they walked to Jonathan's sleek charcoal sedan. The city lights glittered against the mirrored glass of nearby buildings, reflecting long ribbons of gold across the pavement. Sophie breathed in the cold air, her heart still beating with the electricity of the evening. Once they were on the road, Jonathan kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting loosely against the console. He didn't rush to speak. He let the hum of the engine and the faint sound of jazz on the radio fill the space between them. Finally, in his even, thoughtful voice, he said, "You know, I've been thinking." Sophie turned slightly, curious. "About what?" "There's a new project line we're launching, a modern meets nostalgic concept. Softer textures, more story-driven interiors. It needs a face, someone with taste that feels lived in, authentic." He glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. "I think that someone might be you." Her breath caught, not dramatically, but in the quiet way dreams resurface. Fragile, unexpected, beautifully familiar. "Me?" she asked softly. "Why not you?" Jonathan replied with a faint smile. "You see spaces the way people feel them. That's rare." Sophie turned toward the window then, watching Denver pass by. The city glowing with a promise she once thought belonged to younger, braver versions of herself. The lights shimmered on the glass, reflecting against her eyes like scattered stars. For the first time in years, she felt the future leaning toward her instead of away. Not because of a man, not because of a miracle, but because she had stepped, cautiously, trembling at first, then steadily, into the life she had once dreamed of. And tonight proved she belonged there. The house was dark when Sophie stepped inside. The only light came from a street lamp spilling a pale, fractured glow through the front window, slicing the living room into strips of shadow and faint gold. She closed the door quietly behind her, slipping out of her heels and placing them neatly by the mat. Her feet ached, but it was a pleasant ache. The kind that came with movement, with standing tall, with being seen. She barely had time to take a breath before she sensed him. Mark was sitting on the couch, swallowed by the darkness, his figure just a silhouette against the window. The television was off. The room felt strangely airless, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for her. "Nice night?" His voice came from the shadows, low and sharp. Sophie didn't flinch. She set her clutch down on the console table. "It was," she answered simply. He stood up abruptly, stepping forward into the weak strip of light. His face was tight, anger etched into every line, but beneath it, something else flickered. fear. "Did you sleep with him?" Mark snapped. "Just tell me, did you sleep with Pierce?" His words hung in the air like a slap. Years ago, a question like that would have shattered her. The accusation, the contempt, the attempt to pin guilt on her to distract from his own. Now she simply studied him. The irony was almost bitterly poetic. She didn't raise her voice. "Do you hear yourself, Mark?" He scoffed. "Don't turn this around. You show up at my event on his arm, looking like that." "Your event?" she interrupted softly. "You mean the one where your boss brought me in as his guest?" He faltered, then pushed forward anyway. "Everyone saw you together. You think I didn't see the way he looked at you?" Sophie folded her arms loosely, not defensive, just steady. "Did you ever notice how you looked at me, or rather, how you stopped?" she asked. "Because I have been here for years, Mark, and you only care now when someone else finally sees what you refuse to." His mouth opened, then closed. He looked off balance like he'd stepped onto a moving train and realized too late. "You're my wife," he said, as if that answered anything. "I'm the woman you mocked in front of your coworkers," she replied quietly. "The swamp scarecrow you laughed about. The person you left at home with screaming babies and therapy appointments while you fell asleep on the couch and smelled like someone else's perfume." Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it softened, and that softness was harder for him to withstand than any scream would have been. "For years, I was alone in this marriage," she continued. "I begged you to talk to me. You told me to find someone else to listen. You left me to hold everything together. The kids, the house, my mother, my own sanity, while you decided you were too important to show up." He swallowed, his eyes flickering. "We used to love each other," he muttered, the words less like a statement and more like a plea. "It wasn't always like this." "I know," Sophie said, and for a brief moment her expression softened with real sadness. "We did love each other once, or at least I loved you. I fought for us, even when you didn't." Silence filled the room. Mark's shoulders slumped. The anger began to slip, replaced by a kind of exhausted desperation. He sank back down onto the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped in front of his mouth. "I don't know when it all went wrong," he said thickly. I thought this was how it was. I thought you'd always be there." "That's the problem," Sophie answered. "You never noticed that I was here as a person, only as infrastructure. The one who cooked and cleaned and absorbed your moods. You didn't see me until another man treated me like I had value." He looked up at her, eyes wet, regret finally breaking through. "What are you saying, that it's over?" His voice cracked. "Just like that?" She took a slow breath. Her heart ached, but not with panic, with acceptance. "I'm saying I don't want to fight for something hollow anymore," she said. "I'm tired, Mark. Tired of begging for scraps of respect. Tired of raising our kids inside a house where their mother is invisible. I can't do it anymore." He shook his head, as if trying to dislodge her words. "So what? What happens now?" Sophie looked him straight in the eyes. "You have a choice," she said. "You can move out, find an apartment, figure out your life. Or tomorrow, I take the kids and go stay with my mother in Boulder. I won't keep them in this tension. They deserve better. I deserve better." The room seemed to tilt. Mark stared at her like he was seeing the end of something he hadn't believed would ever truly end. "You'd really leave?" he whispered. "I already have," she replied gently. "You're just seeing it now." The next morning broke gray and heavy, clouds hanging low over the Aurora streets. Sophie woke early, the decision from the night before lying calmly in her chest, like a stone she had finally stopped trying to roll uphill. She moved quietly through the kitchen, scrambling eggs, making toast, pouring orange juice. While the coffee brewed, she packed bags in the bedroom, clothes, favorite toys, a few books, school essentials. She worked with the careful efficiency of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. Mark appeared in the doorway as she zipped the last bag. He leaned against the frame, looking pale, like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes lingered on the bags, then on her. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The kids, on the other hand, were wide awake and buzzing with energy. "Are we really going to Grandma's?" her daughter asked, eyes sparkling. "For more than just the weekend?" "For a little while," Sophie said, smoothing her hair back. "You love Grandma's house, remember? The backyard with the big tree? The cookies, she pretends, are healthy because they have oats." The children laughed, excited by the adventure. To them, it was an unexpected treat, a change of scenery, a visit filled with comfort and love. The weight of what it meant sat only with the adults. Sophie carried the bags to the car, loading them into the trunk. The air smelled like rain, that heavy electric scent that comes just before the first drops fall. The kids climbed into the back seat, buckling themselves in, chattering about which toys they'd show Grandma first. She closed the trunk, then turned toward the house one last time. Mark stood on the doorstep, hands at his sides, shoulders drawn. His eyes searched her face, desperate for some hint that she might change her mind. She didn't. Sophie walked to the driver's side door, opened it, and paused only long enough to say, softly, "I hope you figure yourself out, Mark, for your sake, and for theirs." He nodded once, throat tight, unable to answer. She got into the car, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. As she drove down the street, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windshield. It didn't feel ominous. It felt cleansing. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't savoring revenge. She was simply free. Free to drive toward Boulder, toward her mother's warm kitchen, her children's laughter under the big tree, the quiet of a home where she would be seen again, toward a life she was finally ready to inhabit fully. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller, then disappeared. On the front step, Mark remained standing, watching the car shrink into the distance until it was nothing more than a dot, then nothing at all. Only then did he truly understand the weight of everything he had destroyed. And by that time, Sophie was already gone.